This video is for a big island style saddle rigging. It has 3 or 4 stopping points so that you can take your time. You can use any slick fork tree. I'm sorry, the one I had today was not a Hawaiian tree. It's a wade with a smaller horn, but it'll work. I always use rawhide that has not been dried out before. Here's some double shoulders, rawhide, sitting on towels to get out the excess water. The green fabric is my pattern. Your long pieces for the braids come off in this direction, but if there's a knife cut or something, you can do this in an arc. But this is the pattern on the rawhide. When you create a pattern of fabric and test it on your tree, it saves you a lot of time and a lot of guesswork. Here's how my pattern goes on. I like to put a slit so that it hangs on the horn. Starting on the left side of the fork, these would go down to become braids. It wraps around the fork and up over the horn and all the way across to the right side, and this will become braids going down. Creating a pattern has saved me a lot of time, and it helps me find my way around as soon as I begin to get the rawhide onto the three-dimensional tree. When I use deer rawhide, the strands have to curve around a lot more. Most riggings aren't going to need that slit that I dropped over the horn, but since this tree has a small horn, it really helped. Here I am wrapping the fresh rawhide around the tree, getting things into position. I use a stand that has holes down at the bottom so that I can tie things off, but you would get away with a sawhorse if you want to. Even a plastic sawhorse can work. So my hide is just generally here in position. It needs to shrink down as it dries up, but now I'll start with tying off the front of the horn and around the neck. That part in front of the horn is called the picot, and as the hide dries, you're going to need to retighten both of these tie-off points on a daily basis. Using thread that you would hand sew with, nice thick waxed cord, I poke some holes, as you can see here, for the fork cover and the strands, and I anchor them off to the bottom of my saddle stand. Since this hide is fresh off the cow and has never been dried out, I am applying tension while it dries, and it pre-stretches the strands that are going to become braids. Basically, things can't shrink up and shift and get out of position while this rawhide dries. This is my stopping point for today. I went ahead and laced it up underneath the fork there too. So with the dehumidifier running, this can sit indefinitely until I'm ready to work on it again, but I'm going to give it at least 4 days to dry out. Here's how it looks the next day. Things are starting to get golden in color. Daily, you're going to go and retighten the horn wrap around the neck and check the picot. Maybe tie that thread a little tighter. And I don't proceed to the next step until things have fully dried out. Now it's time to cut my strands, and that means I have to moisten them the night before. It might take up to 2 days to get the moisture right before things are ready to cut. So that's where you use a spray bottle, towels, and plastic kitchen trash bags to case the rawhide, which casing means getting moisture into it, so that you could cut it. There's 2 ways to cut your strands. You can work up from the bottom like you see here with kitchen shears, or you can cut from the top down with a really sharp blade like a brand new utility knife. Frankly, you have more control using kitchen shears. You can go a little bit at a time, and you're less likely to slip as you could do with a knife and cut through one of your strands. Here we are with a time lapse. You can watch me cut my strands. Strands are cut, and now it is time to trim the fork cover. I'm just using my wing dividers to press into the cased rawhide so the line shows. And that green you see in the picture is a thin cutting board. I've actually jammed that cutting board up underneath the rawhide so that when I cut it, there's no chance that I'll cut the rawhide layer underneath, which is where the strands are going to come from. Scribe a line first, just through the surface of the rawhide so that you have control. Depending on how thick your hide is and how dry it is, it may take 3 or more passes, even with a sharp knife, to cut all the way through it. And control is important, so take your time, layer by layer. With the cutting board, you could put a piece of leather in there if you didn't have a thin plastic cutting board. I switched to this knife. I feel like it's going to give me more control. I like the hooked blade. You can buy these from Tandy, among other places. They fit into a little X-Acto knife. But just trimming off the extra hide. I'm losing those holes and stretch holes that are from when I tied the hide off on the stand so that it could dry in the first step. I try to set the height of the fork cover to be just a little bit above the junction of the bar and the fork. And now that we've trimmed that upper layer, I have to extend the cuts on my strands. So that's what I'm doing right here real quick. Just taking those lines that I cut upwards with the kitchen shears, and now I'm cutting them down from the fork cover. Time to add some braiding soap. This was like Ivory or Dawn soap on a cheese grater with water added. This rawhide is a little dry. Adding soap and spraying some water on it is really going to help get it to the moisture content that I want. I'll be bagging it after this with a kitchen trash bag. Getting the moisture right is a big key to success. We're on the other side of the fork now. We're on the off side, and the layer we need to trim is under the strands. So same story. I'm going to mark a line and then trim it. I'm going to use my cutting mat to protect the tree itself. In a perfect world, the height of both sides match and the thickness of your rawhide matches from one side to the other. It takes some practice to get all of that perfect. It's never perfect. So just like on the other side, I'm cutting my strands just a little higher to that folded point. Okay, I picked up my wing dividers again. I'm going to check the average width of these strands, and that is going to be the height at which I set the line. I'm going to be cutting a slit above the middle strand in each braid. So that's what I'm marking right now with the wing dividers. You have to interlock the upper and lower rawhide layers. So the middle strand of each braid, whether it's Maui style 5 strands or Big Island style 3 strands, the middle strand comes up through a slit, and then everything's interlocked when you braid. Back to one of my favorite little knives. I've got my cutting mat in place to protect everything. You can slip with this knife, so go really slow. Scribe the exact amount of area you want to cut, and eventually you can cut all the way through and walk this blade really carefully to the edges. I have a couple different fids to open the hole with. A fid is just a blunt tapered shaft. So one is made of antler and one is made of metal. Now that I have these slits cut, I know that I need to carry the middle strand cuts just a little bit higher, and I'm not going to be able to get this strand through that hole until I cut the tip of it and taper it. So there's that fid I was talking about. I'm going to open the hole with it. And I've cut the middle strand down to a nice tapered point. You can use shears, but I'm just pulling with a blade and using my thumb as a guide. I really like the moisture content in the strands right now. Things are fairly stiff and hold their own shape, but they're pliable. They'll bend without cracking. A little bit of soap will help this strand glide through the hole without stressing anything. So I'm applying some soap, and then I'm going to run the tip of it through the hole from up underneath. Here we go. I'm able to pull this by hand, which is great. If you need pliers, you can grab the strand with pliers, but pliers do leave marks, at least temporarily, on the rawhide. So be careful where you grab it. So I'm going to interlock the middle strand in this manner on all the braids. Here we are marking the places where I'm going to cut on the off side. And the off side, which for any right-handed rider and roper is always going to be the right side of the saddle. I do these riggings in reverse for left-handed ropers. But the offside is kind of fun because the rearward braid has additional places where the strands interlock. Right now I'm just marking the holes for the middle strands. But now we're coming over to that last braid. The last strand of the last braid, I'm going to carry my cut about halfway towards the base of the horn and cut a notch right here and feed this strand down through here. This helps lock down your rawhide wrap. Time lapse of braiding. Okay, when you braid, you're going to want to cross the same strand over first for all the braids on that side. I've chosen to take the forward strand and pass and cross it first. Braiding this rawhide is going to be hard on your hands. You can see that it's fairly stiff. If I had it so wet that it was floppy and squishy like a noodle, it would be easier to braid, but then when it dried, it would dry with gaps. Plus the strands would get all out of shape and mushy, and the final product just wouldn't look as nice. Now that I've passed the strands a couple of times, it's very important that I pull each strand. You can see me pulling there before I pass it across. So pull first, then pass. Braiding soap is your friend. You want your strands to all be soaped so that when you pull, the strand tightens several passes up above it. So this isn't like braiding hair where you just crisscross the pieces. Each strand has to be pulled firmly with even pressure and then passed. When I braid, I try to be as ambidextrous as possible, so I'm pulling with my left hand with the same amount of force as I pull with my right hand, and this helps the braid stay straight and even. As for stopping points, if the moisture isn't right, you're going to be forced to stop. But I like to trim and interlock my strands in one session, bag it, walk away, come back and braid in a different session, get all the braids done, bag it, walk away, and wait until the next day to get the rings on. So, of course, I got to take the bag off. I have to check the moisture in these braids, make sure that it's decent. And each one of these strands needs to be trimmed to a point. That's what I'm doing here. I get my brass rings from Bork Saddlery Hardware in Pendleton, Oregon. They also make round rings. These are flat, beveled, and polished. I'm going to bring these braids through and fold them and try to get the length just right with all 4 braids so that I'm happy with the ring height. When I splice these strands back into the body of the braid, it's going to cause everything to shorten. So I need to choose a ring height that's 1.5 inches lower than where I expect the height to be when it's all finished. The ring is curved, so I have to make sure that the lengths of each braid match that curve. A couple of these braids are so long, I'm going to have to unbraid them and trim the ends shorter. So I've trimmed my ends and made sure that the braids are unbraided to the right length. It's time to splice the strand ends into the body of the braid, and each person has a different way of doing this. I'll just show you mine. I try to make sure that since it's a 3-strand braid, there's 2 on one side, 1 on the other, and all the braids kind of have that same pattern. Using my antler fit, I'm going to open a hole between strands and then just point the tip down through that hole, but not pull it real tight because I have 2 more strands to try to fit into this braid. I'll pull everything tight at the end. Okay, just below it, I'll make the next hole for this strand coming from the opposite side. This whole process, you can try it, and if you don't like how things shift or the length of the braids or how it looks, you can just walk the strands back out and try again. So now all 3 just kind of are arched there, and I can switch to my pliers and pull the tips with the pliers and get everything a little tighter. Things are a little drier than when I braided, so there's resistance from time to time, but this rawhide is by no means completely dry. It's still going to cooperate. Almost done. I like this method because it puts the strand ends hiding inside the doubled braid, and they're just less likely to wear off with time and use of the saddle. Switching to this view, you can see my braids a little closer. Hopefully you can see where I place the holes on the braid and get an idea of how this works. It's pretty simple. But everything does shorten in length when you do this part. So that's where the surprises tend to be. If you're not happy with the ring height or if the braid lengths become uneven, you might have to undo it. Walk them out and pick a new place on the braid, higher or lower, to make your holes. And try splicing it through again until you're satisfied. Here I am just folding the strands over, and that helps me choose where on the braid to set the fid and open up a hole. Braiding takes a long time, but splicing the strands can be time consuming too. But this is an important step, so it's okay to take your time and check and recheck and make sure you're happy with it. Pulling things tighter. Since things were becoming so dry, I'm going to hit this with a little bit of water from the spray bottle and then bag it up while I work on the other side. There's some important details about this process that I'll mention as you watch me get the other side done. One thing you want to know is you want to set the ring height and angle to follow the angle of the fork. Most of these saddles are rigged in what I would call like a 3/4 rigging position. And then if you can, see this junction between the fork and the bar? It's kind of a recessed place. That's where I want my splices to go if I can position them there, because that's the least amount of bulk sticking up. It'll cause the brace to be rubbed on less if I can position my splices in that junction right there. So once again, I'm going to set the ring height lower than the finished height that I desire. I'm going to try to make sure that the braids follow the angle of the fork. It looks like my middle two braids are too tall, just like on the other side. I'm going to have to unbraid them a little bit and then trim them shorter. To save time, we've got a time lapse here. Things go so much faster with time lapse. These saddles were designed to have a rigging strap going from the ring behind the cantle to the other ring. You can make that from rawhide or paracord. I haven't made mine yet, but it's time to put it on a car jack. That's from my Chevy Silverado, that car jack, and then I have it braced against a piece of metal bar stock, but you could use a piece of wood too if it was sturdy enough. Most of the stretch was taken out of this rawhide in the first step at the beginning of the video, so I do not need to crank overly hard with the car jack while this dries. It's just going to provide enough tension for everything to be pulled reasonably tight, and then it dries in that position for a couple days. I used orange baling twine to connect one ring to the other behind the cantle, and once I set the angle of these braids, I noticed that this rear braid was just sticking down too far. It was loose. It didn't have any tension on the ring, so I unbraided it just a couple of passes, maybe only 2, and then brought the tips of the strands back up through the same holes. And after this point, I'm satisfied with it. And I let the tree dry on the car jack for just a couple days. And then you'll see a picture of the finished rigging. Black paracord rigging strap, black paracord horn wrap that was requested by the customer. This tree went off to the customer with just the rigging on it. So I did not do the leather cover to finish the rest of this saddle. There's the picot, all nice and trimmed up. I trimmed and tacked the hide underneath the fork because the fork had very low clearance over the horse's withers. And here you see that black paracord rigging strap. These saddles will not work properly without support of the rigging ring behind the cantle. Thanks so much for watching. Send your questions to me and I'll try to help. I want to enable you to be able to do this on your own. Aloha.